Okay. Yesterday I was talking about some issues around self, other, the nature of God as the sort of unity um, beneath both. And I was also talking about the nature of desire as a seeing of oneself or of one's own image in the beloved. Um, and I was aware of a sort of reciprocal relationship, um, between self and beloved other, um, that kind of rhymed with the Euthyphro dilemma, and at the level of God or of ultimate reality, looks like a technical resolution to the Euthyphro dilemma, um, which asks. Basically, whether God loves what's good because it's good, or is what's good um, good just because God loves it, and um, and so there's a sort of question around, and it's hard to express. I struggled to express it yesterday, and I'm going to try again today. Let me put the link in the chat. For anyone who wants to join, and it doesn't have to be about what I'm talking about. But it is about the sort of, I've called it a Droste effect, a phenomenon of two mirrors reflecting each other. The Droste effect that occurs in the gaze of two people who love each other, because each one sees his own identity in the other, his or her own identity in the other. And then the question is, whose identity is being seen, because the identity of each one is defined on the other. I see my identity in you, but you are an inseparable part of the identity that I see in you, and I an inseparable part of the identity of your identity, which you see in me, and so on. So if one was trying to sort of find, what do I want to say, the original reflection down that infinite hall of mirrors, so to speak, that is the Droste effect, how would one ever find it? And yet there's something in the phenomenon of one's own existence that I'm thinking of Zeno's paradoxes of motion, where you have a continuum that's infinitely subdivisible. Somehow all the logical steps to span the infinite distance between God over here and us over there, the infinite distance between God and not God, it's like the infinite subdivisibility of the continuum. Before the tortoise can get to Achilles, he has to get halfway. Before he can get halfway, he has to get a quarter way. Before he gets a quarter way, he has to get an eighth way, and so on. And but it's something like this, because I've spoken of love as an affirmation of one's identity, and of affirmation as mirroring. And there's almost like in this, that when two see each other as in their image of the image, or which is of the self/God, they are mutually successively mirroring each other, becoming more like the image of the other. And if one were to sort of divide by zero and collapse the limit and go all the way there from God over here to us over there, and it's like the resultant phenomenon would be the or what appears to be the unary identity of the individual person. And so how I've spoken of that is like the beatific vision is it your vision of God or God's vision of you? The answer is supposed to be yes. The God who's beyond all binaries is not going to merely be another over here as one is a self over there. Like I said yesterday, if my ultimate encounter with God was of someone just radically, transcendently, always other, it would only make me wonder what was what was the ground of being beneath him and me. The still more transcendent ground of being, because more imminent, between me and God, the notional sort of ground of being. And then there are a lot of people were saying, for quite understandable reasons, that I was losing personhood. And I answered back that I felt that all I was noting really was the way in which self and other are, again, I'll use the language, like infinitely interdefined. If I want to find sort of the heart of my identity, I can't find it without reference to the other. And but again, I think the point is to go deeper and to note that when one wants to find the identity of the other, it's more originally presupposing some reference to oneself, but that's not even quite what I meant to say. I'm sorry, there's a few distractions happening around me. It's also related to this that I was thinking about this morning as I was reading the Bible in Hebrew, but in an interlinear, because I can't really read Hebrew. And it made me think of how in my field there's something called language sample analysis, and it's not just in my field, where you can basically look at a transcript of what someone says and analyze it. And there are differences that emerge between men and women when you do this kind of language sample analysis. That men tend to use more nouns, and the more masculine, let's say, is a person's way of using language, the more they will tend to take what for others were sort of these relational processes involving verbs, and clauses, and kind of boil them down to a noun, nominalize them or reify them. And in that way, so like words like nominalization and reification are examples of what I just said, because without the nouns, I would be forced to say something like the process of taking and even process is a noun, but like let me use the verb phrase, taking a clause with a verb and turning it into a noun. And so whereas they found with women there were more pronouns, and I believe also more verbs. I'm not really sure if there was more verbs. Maybe there were. Because the thing is, it would depend on if you're counting, it's sort of technical, but if you're counting marked verbs versus unmarked, I would think there would be more verbs overall in women's speech, but I'm not 100% sure. The number of marked verbs is always going to be roughly equal, but verbs total, like including marked and unmarked, but also crucially, women had more pronouns in their speech. And in whatever study that I'm thinking of that I can't remember the title of or the authors of. And when you read the Hebrew Bible, what's quite interesting about it is that it's exactly corresponding to like how women are supposed to speak per the findings of that study on language, on gender differences and language sample analysis. It's very relational. It's all pronouns and it's all verbs and it's all dynamic sort of processes. And that's I guess what Barfield spoke of as Jerusalem, and it's sort of concrete and experiential way of seeing the world. And he contrasted that with Athens, in connection with which we may think of Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, who spoke of, just, my problem with speaking about Plotinus is that I haven't actually read him enough to generalize about him, but it's like he's talking about a transcendent mathematical object when he talks about this sort of transcendent unity beyond unity and multiplicity as sort of initially conceived, or juxtaposed with each other. And it's like a sort of transcendent mathematical object that contains every real phenomenon as a sort of logical entailment of itself. And the thing though with the logical entailment is that whatever is entailed is entailed by something with some kind of definable or nameable essence or property. But the issue with the one is that it's never really quite definable, statically categorizable. And so one doesn't really take it in the way that the intellect, derives a conclusion from a series of premises. It means that, at the bottom level, the level of ultimate reality, what we find is, instead of something impersonal, law-like, defined, static, forced to keep going along the way that it's always been going, in that sense, sort of unthinking, what we find instead is something unpredictable, from a systematic standpoint, or statistical standpoint, or any standpoint of any system. But it is relational, or he is relational. And I guess, I'm not meaning here to dismiss Plotinus so much as I am just kind of interacting with, what one could, some kind of low resolution or 2D representation of one way that one could take him, even if it was a mistaking of him. The sense I got yesterday was that people were preferring the kind of stark contrast of like self and other, of Jerusalem, that they felt that I was losing. And I sort of mused this morning that the starkness of that difference between self and other is in a sense logically guaranteed by the absolute, like, unthinkability of the one. As far as the east is from the westness of the distance between self and other would in some sense be guaranteed by logical, the unthinkability, in that sense, the illogical nature of the one. It's being both X and not X. And so that's sort of guaranteeing that at the level of distinction, there's a sort of eternal distinction between self and other. Although actually, I'm not sure I should use the word eternal in connection with any distinction. If the ultimate reality is unity, that's suggesting that what every philosopher sort of intuitively senses, that every distinction in fact has a breaking point. There's no distinction that is olam or forever. It always breaks down somewhere, some way, somehow. But nonetheless, this is something that I was talking about yesterday. One feels like one always has one's beginning place in distinctions. And then, from or within the realm of distinction, logic is a method which presupposes distinctions. And using okay, put it another way, the world of distinctions is the realm of the excluded middle, the principle of non-contradiction, either X or not X. And the very methodology of this realm seems to ultimately take us out of this realm into another place, because it says that logic is distinguished from something undistinguished. The realm of logic is distinguished from what Chris Langan called a one valued logic. You might say a realm of one valued logic. In fact, his image that he used was quite interesting. Was like you have a glacier or a piece of ice in water, and the glacier is the realm of two valued logic or distinctions, and the water is the realm of one valued logic. And the crucial thing to note is that water is the thing that's held in common between both. So there, another way is like this, that and this is Langan's way. This is what he calls the principle of sin diffeonesis, and then it has as its entailment like this, like it's like a generalization of like some ultimate medium of reduction, and it follows really naturally from what I'm about to explain. So basically, if you have a distinction between two things, like a logical distinction where there's an X, and since it's either X or not X, that means X is not X. And that's, mathematically you can substitute not X for X, and it should work in symbolic logic. And yet, the fact that we're here dealing with both an X and a not X suggests that there's a union set, namely both X and not X, underneath the distinction between either X or not X. So if one goes to the most generic level possible, which is the level of like the principle of non-contradiction itself, where things are always either X or not X, that's again presupposing a sort of a place of deeper unity that is necessarily in the nature of both X and not X. And so that's what I yesterday was talking about, the sense in which the one begins in distinction, finds itself through this finitude or distinction. Finitude is just whenever something has its identity in opposition to something else. And then when it arrives through finitude or distinction, to itself, the one, then it sort of sees where it began as being in its own nature. Sort of like T.S. Eliot talking about a strange loop, basically, an Escher's staircase. You return to the place where you began, but know it for the first time. In our case, it's paradise or Eden, something like that. You have the notion of getting back to the garden or reuniting with God, which is really interesting because like, no man has seen God at any time. So it's like a meeting God, I wrote, would be like reuniting with him for the first time. And when I shared that with my friend, they were like, that's just stupid. I don't get that at all. That's the only acceptable real response to anything that I'm saying, by the way. Yeah, there's that sense of a strange loop or an Escher staircase, the one returning to itself. And of course, to many people, that sounds sort of awfully New Age. I've shared my sense in the past with Wayne Fair that like the question of whether there is like whether our existence is best understood as coming forth, a being sent from some place of pre-existence in which God knew us originally, sort of in our essence, like the abstract idea of us, but we weren't yet realized, we weren't yet made flesh and tempered by trials and adversity, and given full concrete being thereby, um, uh, and in which something of our destinies was foreknown. Whether this perspective, like what the Mormons believe, or different other people, different other groups believe. I've heard Protestant churches. Like I was at one charismatic church where the pastor just straight up said, Scripture, if you're reading it properly, it clearly says that God foreknew us when we were still in the loins of God. Before you were formed, I knew you, was probably the proof text that he used. I can't quite remember. Whether our existence is best understood in this way, and again, in the near-death experiences, this is such a frequent phenomenon. This happens very often. I mean, where it happens, I've noticed this multiple times in multiple experiences. People said Jesus appeared to them and said, you signed a contract. We had an agreement that you would do this or do that, that you would do what you said to do. And you so far have not done it. And, that kind of makes sense in the sense that eternity is all times. And so that if you're there, if you ever get there, then you're there now, so to speak. And, or even more, that what exists once is always already there. God being logically incapable of forgetting, not just because in some way that we don't like, forgetting sounds like a defect, but really because God is not absolutely distinguishable from the fabric of events, the tapestry of events that is his universe, in a way that eternity is something like the very relationship between time and eternity, which I know sounds like I'm just using a word to define a word, but eternity is going to be one of those terms that's convertible with God. And it's going to, in a way like God does, presuppose itself being the ultimate reality. It has no more fundamental reality to refer to when one is seeking its definition. So like infinity is the relationship between finitude and infinity. Eternity is the relationship between time and eternity. And God is something like the very God-world relation, between creation and God, because he's the ground of being beneath creation and the ground of being that's conceived as being totally apart from creation, which is, it only works as a first approximation, if at all. So eternity is like the relationship between time and eternity, and there's a way that, and also that if some piece of this were to go missing, it would destroy its logical integrity. Indra's web, all real events connected in the way that they are. If some piece of it were to go missing, it would threaten the logical integrity of the system as a whole, and in that way, it would sort of, to the extent that you might say God's identity is particular and defined at all, if only self-defined rather than completely undefined, it's going to destroy the identity of the universe with which God both is and is not identified, sort of almost in phases, if one is sort of seeking to understand that relationship through like dialectical logic. So, God doesn't forget, point being, whatever exists ever exists always. And so, there's some reason to believe that you're already in eternity. You might say, you have a double or a higher self. There's different ways it's been thought about. I'm not entirely sure how best to think about it, but the idea that this experience itself is almost like a strange loop type interaction between time and eternity, where you're always getting feedback from your sort of eternal or higher self. It makes sense to me, and the parallel that comes to my mind when I think of that is how, the way that the brain actually plans and executes movement is it has first an idea of where the hand is going to go, and then there's a feedback loop where it looks to see if the hand actually met the target, or if it overshot, or if it undershot, and then it creates a new idea for where it should go, and so on and so forth. So it's very natural, I think, actually. I wouldn't really, the way that it works between time and eternity, I wouldn't think it's something radically other than what we can conceive. I would think that it should actually map onto just how we experience reality moment to moment already. So, should it be seen this way, with a sort of double of oneself in eternity, which properly is, it's neither, it's not anymore. The issue with taking the pre-existence idea too naively is pre-existence. I mean, in eternity, it's not really going to be any more pre-existence than it is post-existence. But likewise, when you run your race and you get to the end, if it's really, to the extent that what you've arrived at is really eternity, then it's not going to be any more post-existence than it bears description as pre-existence. And the only way I really know how to describe that is like how I've prayed to God at certain times in certain ways about my son, where basically, like, if I ever fail him in this regard, I need you to twist my arm, because I swore to you, whether in the in the pre-existence, or at the end of this life, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make a difference. I told, basically I told you to twist my arm if I ever sort of thought of backing out or failing him in whatever way. Kind of like people will get themselves banned from casinos or something like that. So even like they themselves will send the casino a notice that they are not to be allowed into that casino, and then they'll try to come in and say, hey, I wasn't I was not the one who wrote that. Actually, my brother-in-law did. I and my own will, I still want to be at this casino. And they're like, no, it's your signature on it, etc. So there's this way of looking at things. And that's the way that, to me, if I'm trying to understand a soul contract in some way that isn't dumb, that isn't just like straight linear time, like first pre-existence, then linear time, then post-existence. Because then it's like, instead of eternity transcending linear time, we almost have linear time transcending eternity. It's like a linearization of what was supposed to be non-linear. That's how my best way into trying to understand something like a soul contract, or like this idea of like a purpose for which, a predestination for which God meant you from before the world began. But then it's like I said to Wayne in one of my last conversations with him, the other way of seeing it is that in order for things to have meaning, there has to be, again, if we're beginning from a place of distinctions, from logic, where terms are on complements, it would seem that the only way things can really have meaning is if you're kind of emerging from a place of absolute darkness or non-existence, in an almost like infinitely linear course upward to the absolute light of being. And that, but again, it has to be like this kind of bursting forth from nothingness, or ex nihilo creation for things to, just the sense that it has to be that way for things to really have meaning. And I think that really the way it works probably contains elements of both, like a top down and a bottom up approach like that. I think all processes that are in God show his nature. like that and involving both, being sort of both top down and bottom up, in the way that, you know, I meant when I was talking about the way that the brain sort of plans and executes motor movement with feedback, which of course is still all pretty abstract and obscure at this level. But these are all the things that I think about when I think about desire and self and other, and the nature of desire as seeing one's own likeness in the thing that is beloved. And there's a bit more that I'll say about that, but I should go looking at the comments. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I see too much to interact there yet. I mean, if I were a better conversationalist, I would, but it's not triggering anything very, very particular or very intelligent that I can say in response. You know, I don't hardly understand. I mean, I don't understand quantum entanglement. Except that, you know, insofar as it is sort of like transcending like you know, ordinary spatio-temporal causation. It's suggesting, you know, some kind of atemporal way of looking at causation, or at least, you know, relating things. Yeah, let me just kind of take a break here for 1 second. Well, yeah, I'm not really sure I have too much to say. You know, I don't like to talk about things that I feel like I understand pretty well already, but there might be some advantage to discussing them. I like to try to get ahead of my head, like Luke says. I like to talk about more what's on the edge of my understanding. But since a lot of what I've said about like judgment, like final judgment, isn't you know, known to you guys, you know, it might not be such a bad thing for me to rehash it on the way to my next point. But you know, the notion of seeing, the notion of this sort of absolute both X and not X, like at the ground of the principle of non-contradiction itself. You know, we have that idea. If logic has anything to say at all, it's suggesting that there's that. And if logic doesn't have anything to say, then we're sort of in the same place, the place of absolute both and. And if to love something is to see one's own likeness in it, and here's what I mean by that, because for God it's sort of easier to see, because like we have Genesis, where he creates in his image and calls creation good. To say that God calls good whatever is in his own image, you know, it's like it's already right there. You would have a resolution of the Euthyphro dilemma. Because God is the good. He creates something in His image, and it's good. And the question is it's good? Is it good because He judged it good? Like He saw the resemblance between Himself and it, or is it good because it just was good? Because it was in His image. The answer is yes. But for individuals, for sort of yes, Joseph, I'm aware that yeah, I'm using it a little bit loosely. Uh, okay, I'm wondering if I should interact with Joseph, or I should sort of keep going. Joseph, you have an open invitation to come on and interrogate me personally, but if not, I'm going to just keep pursuing this thread. What I mean when I say that, like, an imager, like one of us, sees his own image in whatever he loves. The way that I'm using, like, self there, like it's one's self image, is a very elusive or tricky way, because it's actually using self without a complement. We're in the image of God, and one of the ways that I understand that is the way in which we are our own universe. There's a certain way that if we were the only person who existed, we would never know it. And so there's a way that whatever one knows of God is necessarily all within the realm of one's own experience, and everything that one experiences bears description as oneself, in as much as it's within one's consciousness, and subjectively identified with that person in that way. And so whenever one sees something or someone lovely, that person or thing is evoking every good and beautiful thing that the person has seen in sort of the totality of their experience or consciousness. And in that way, see, because for it to be lovely, it's going to be an image of their highest image or conception of the infinite. And intuitively, I think that one's own image of oneself, I guess, where self again is understood in this widest possible sense, where it doesn't have the ordinary complement we assign it of the world external to the place that we think of as being behind our eyes, at least nowadays. In the old days, they thought it was in the heart or the belly, different cultures. But oh wait, Joseph does want to join. I'm just at the point of making this point. Let me see if I can finish.
Make the point.
We'll go to your stuff. One's image of oneself is going to be, itself in this widest sense, I think, is going to be one's highest image of the infinite, and that is whatever one is seeing in the beloved thing or object. I'll put a period over there. Now, what's up, Joseph? How are you doing?
Good, Cal. I debated because I'm working, but I'm at home, and I felt like this. I do want to interrogate you a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because I think it would be good to get more. If we're gonna really say look at the Genesis here as the point of departure at some level, which you keep referring back to. I think we actually have to take that seriously, and and there are parts of what you said, especially the first 5 minutes, where I was totally, I knew what you were saying. I was on board. There's parts where I couldn't quite follow after that, but I think it's very, very curious that man is actually never called good in creation.
Okay. Right.
And in fact, the one thing that God says about man's creation is that there's something not good about it, which he's alone, or they are alone, depending on how you understand what that first person was. And that is in contrast to something that is good for God, right? God is alone, and yet it is precisely in man's aloneness that there's a problem. And the rabbis are very, very specific about they focus on this almost immediately, because they're saying originally, like, man was meant to be alone in a way, like, because God, or at least it seems like there's an original plan of creation where man reflects God, and man is alone just like God is alone, but that something's problematic with that automatically, almost, or immediately upon self-reflection of God, and that perhaps the good for God is not the same as the good for man, and therefore it is not this kind of, I'm going to call good what I see as good in myself, or see what is good in the infinite that we can apply to God. And this gets into your whole Euthyphro, like this. You were right to point to the Euthyphro dilemma here, because I think it's precisely gets to kind of the tension in that, and also this gets to the same thing. We see this at the next level down, where man can't find a partner in the other animals, specifically, right? That there is something. There's something lacking in that ability to, even though they share.
He doesn't see his own likeness in them. They're different.
Yeah, and yet there's also this. He learns something about his identity from interaction with these others. Yes. What he needs as a partner, right? I mean, that's this whole. But I would also there was something you said. Well, there's a couple of things you said that I want to kind of also bring into this too earlier, right? Because you said something about like, this problem of finding identity, so so you need to encounter the other's identity to kind of figure out your own identity, or like there's something around those lines that you said earlier.
Somewhat, yeah.
But there is also this relationality. Relationality is not identity. And I think, and you sort of touched on this in the Hebrew discussion, but like getting a little more clarity there on like, so, and this is why I asked the first question I had about, what do you mean when you say, what is the ground of the principle of non-contradiction? Because the ground is not in X and not X, right? It's something beyond both of those things. And it's not about, like, those are contents of the principle of non-contradiction, but those aren't the ground of the principle of non-contradiction. The ground of the principle of non-contradiction is a relational one. It is not an identity-based one, right? And that's kind of the point. And this is why, again, I'm going to bring him up, because I always bring him up in these discussions. Like Levinas, I think, gets at something really important when he, and we can, it's not a perfect argument, but he has this entire, I'd say, like, this process of, let's say, metaphysical awakening of identity and self and other and relationality, but it starts for him in the encounter with the other, which is not an encounter of two identities, but it's just that the other exists, right?
Can I ask you by what logic you say that the ground of the principle of non-contradiction isn't X and not X, but is more than that?
Well, the principle of non-contradiction is not, like, X is not within the principle, right? It is like, it's the not, it's the relationality of what it means to be and to not be, that is what that principle is addressing, right?
Well, I guess you're saying the relationality is something not the same as X and not X, because there's something more than X and not X. But as far as logic has anything to say, it's saying that the not X is already everything that's not X. But you're saying there's more than everything.
This is a metalogical principle, though, right? It has to be grounded in something beyond it itself. You can call it second order logic or whatever you want to call it, but it's
yeah, that's fair.
It transcends this level of logic.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
I think
again, the question is, it seems like as far as logic has anything to say, it's saying it's both X and not X. there's X, and then not X is already everything that isn't X. But you're saying there's more than everything. And I'm wondering, what's the logical route you take to that?
Well, so it's not more than right. Well, the fact that that's everything, I think, points to it, right? Like there's already this step you're making to what I call essentialize everything into these identities of things. But there's something before that which has to occur, and this is Levinas's point, where he says, he calls it ethics, but really he's relationality comes before ontology, because he says it as ethics comes before ontology, because without without any recognition, like without the ability to say something's in relation to something else, you can't say that they're different or the same, right? That's the whole point. But you can't say that something's different or the same than something else without recognizing that there's a relation in the first place. That's what precedes it, logically precedes it in a sense. I mean, but like it's a logic that's not about, it's a relational logic that precedes everything in a sense.
Well, I think I'm taking the point about relationality. I don't really know how it means that it's illegitimate to say that whatever's underneath it is both X and not X. And I wouldn't keep harping on that unless I felt that seems like to be the starting place of your critique. Because you're like, it's a critique, it's identifying a problem. Yeah. I'm still not really sure how it's really a problem, or how that usage is really illegitimate.
It's not illegitimate, but it's not just saying it's not absolute, which you've already said is it's not absolute, but it's
what's not absolute?
Difference. You already said that earlier in this. The different.
Yeah, the difference between X and not X.
Right. But it's not, it's going beyond just saying that the difference is not absolute. So that's part of it. It's saying that it's essentially telling you why they're not absolute in a useful way, to me, at least. Right. So,
to me, the way in which they're seen not to be absolute, in the terms that I'm using, is that there's an identity beneath them.
Well, that's the thing, though. I wouldn't call it,
even if it be the
identity. I think calling it identity is my critique, because
there has to be a sameness for the difference to not be absolute.
So it's a different, I'm using not absolute in a different sense. I'm not using it in a noun essential identity sense. I am using it in a spatial relational sense, right? So the thing that is underneath has to be, that there is a space between them, which is not the same as that they have, that they are, right? It's just a different, it's the verbal relational version, or maybe adverbial more, right? That they,
I'm not sure I'm detecting a meaningful difference here at this register between whether something, is treated of as a verb phrase or as a noun. It's not landing for me yet why these distinctions would matter greatly here.
They matter. Well, I mean, I think they matter. Let's go to this. One of the really big, I'm gonna shift off to a tangential topic to kind of see if it helps us gain clarity. One of the big debates in Jewish philosophy in the 20th century around Sinai was the core event of Sinai that the nation encounters God and therefore knows God exists, like concretely, in the sense of like they've all heard God's voice, right? Is it just the very fact that the encounter occurred is enough, or is it the content of the encounter matters? And to me, this is very similar to this, right? Because like you're saying, the thing, in some ways, like the nounal difference is that is basically saying that it's about the content as opposed to whether the encounter occurs or not. which is the relational. And I get both sides. Honestly, I'm kind of in between the two. I think they're complementary, and you can't really divorce one from the other. Like to say one is more essential than the other is kind of a bit of a false choice in a sense. But like at the same time, if you, right, like, I think there's a nice thought experiment with this, which is like, if you suddenly, I mean, in this is not necessarily a hypothetical because some people really have these, but like, if you suddenly knew, like Sinai happened, and you were there, like whatever, so you had a Sinai moment where you suddenly knew that God existed. And now it does, but you don't necessarily know, let's say, which revelation, whether it's, like the Christian Bible, Tanakh, or the Quran, or whatever. You can pick another, the Vedas. Like you suddenly knew that you had an encounter with God, a divine whatever, but you didn't know like which God. Like how would that affect how you behaved in the world, or if at all, right? Is that encounter adding something to your experience or changing it in some meaningful way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that to the extent that the event was meaningful at all, it would have been meaningful to the extent that it revealed something of the character of that God. And so, like I must change my life so that it would more closely match whatever the character of the ultimate
but here's the thing. People take signs from the universe all the time, right? I got a sign from the universe. It doesn't reveal anything about the content of the giver of the sign, usually, right? Like it's just a sign, and everything else is interpreted by me, right? In that sort of encounter. But if you were really convinced that you got a sign from the universe, but that was essentially contentless, you just knew that it meant that something was out there giving you a sign, right? That would still be meaningful, I would think. Right? That's the point.
I'm sorry if I'm hopelessly, short-sighted. I'm struggling to understand what is the meaning of a contentless sign. Pure that.
So you're thinking about whatever random thing you're thinking about, trying to make a decision. I don't know, whatever it is, and suddenly, And let's say you do something like Eliezer, right? You're at the well, you're coming to the well, whatever, and you say, I have this decision to make. I need a sign that it's the right decision. Now, I'm the one who dictated the terms of that decision. I don't know if that's an internal decision or just temporarily okay. I don't know if it's a moral, or a pragmatic choice. Like I don't know any of that. The universe gives me the sign that the girl comes out and gives me the water at the well, just like I asked for. Okay.
That's just what I was reading today.
Excellent. Look at that. It's a sign. It's a sign. But what is it a sign of, right? Because to me, it's contentless insofar as it doesn't tell you anything about the one giving the sign. It's entirely a choice set by me, and the content is set by me. It doesn't tell me anything. I can try to derive, implicitly, use logic, use all these tricks to try to figure out what does this sign mean?
But can I ask, is it truly contentless, or is it more so just suggestively on the edge of saying something that I have a sense of what it says, but an inarticulate one that I can't put my finger on? Because that's when I phenomenologically get into the sign that just occurred, between you and me and what you just said. That's more so how it feels.
Well, so that's an interesting distinction. I think both are possibilities, right? I think there are some times when you get these signs, and I don't think they necessarily.
You do just continue to feel that it is a meaningful way of using words to speak of a contentless sign. And I'm not saying that with skepticism. I'm just well, for me, I don't quite see it yet, but that's not the same as to say that I know that you're wrong.
Right. So think about let's not say contentless for now. Let's say there's something separate from the content, above and beyond it, where I get a sense of that the other exists, they're present, right? Not just that they exist, but just like when you have, you feel someone watching the back of you, the Absolutely. Back of your head, and your neck prickles or whatever, right? you know that you just know the other is present. You don't know what that means, that their presence means. You just know that they're present, right? Even if they're in the dark or they're hiding behind a screen or whatever, you just get a sense of there's something else out there.
Can I interject and just say that I feel like I know what it means to the extent that I know who they are or what they mean.
Right.
So if that's what you're saying, like the sense that they encountered the presence of God on Sinai, and he didn't, well, and setting aside what he said, but the fact that they encounter his presence, and I guess I would say, like, to me it feels like his presence would have some meaning insofar as his identity was meaningful to them. If it was spoken, they would have some associations, they would think of something, and then that's kind of like, that would be at least the beginnings of the meaning that they would form from, like, the memory of that encounter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What does he mean?
So I think there's it's good to separate this into, right, because there's the encounter of a presence versus then assigning an identity to that presence, or some sort of a proto sense of maybe ineffable, I can't put it into words, but like some ineffable identity to that presence, versus then like a concretized,
because you feel like if you assign an identity, that's in a way it's too exhaustive, like illegitimately trying to exhaust something. Well, that may be.
And part of what's interesting about this, and where one could, I think that's a good point, but is where it probably doesn't really hold up. Because Levinas was doing a lot of this work, and he's in the background of all this for me, because like he's doing a lot of this work on Erik Erikson's work on how children, or how infants first separate themselves from the world as an identity.
Yes, sure.
And I think there's kind of an implicit assumption there that like initially they identify as everything, and then that kind of the first thing that they split from is their mother, and then over time they kind of learn more and more about like what their limits are and their bounds of autonomy and all that stuff. But of course, we know biologically now with newer science that like children clearly recognize identities like almost immediately of like their mother as a different, distinct, and not the same person as a stranger, which implies that we can't, we can, while we can separate these stages out logically, we can't, like, whether they actually are held up biologically is a different question.
Because the idea that intuitively first it would be something like, first there is everything, then there was mother and not mother, and then so on like that. It makes sense from the armchair, but it might be that, in general, the process of individuation is following something like this logic, but it's like way more kind of like fractally, like smaller level and beginning in the womb. And that's kind of why earlier I was using like the sense of an infinitely subdivisible continuum, where nonetheless the kind of little fractal steps or operations, they can have some commonality. But Levinas was building off Erik Erikson's work.
To some extent.
I wouldn't immediately think it would invalidate what he had to say.
No, for sure not. And I mean, he's also not just, right? He's also building off and also critiquing Heidegger at the same time. I mean that, and also phenomenology in general. I mean, Levinas is a phenomenologist, and Husserl and Heidegger play a huge role in who he's responding to.
That's also the very powerful way in which the Ashkenazic Jewish identity is intertwined with the German identity, self and other, and must, in order to know who he is, the Ashkenazi Jew must dialogue with Heidegger and try to make some more ultimate sense of Heidegger, because Heidegger's phenomenology was the continuation of longer tradition of German philosophy, and then it became identified with, certainly something like, the attempt to totally negate, Jewish identity.
Well,
It,
and also
or
Heidegger,
associated with it,
and Heidegger doesn't have an ethics. I mean, that's one of the major things that's weird about his philosophy is he doesn't have a relational ethics, which is, I mean, Levinas was already critiquing this before the 1930s in Heidegger. That's what's so like he started writing his book on this in the 20s already before Heidegger like went in that direction, because he did see this as a huge lack, and he was also being influenced by Buber. Levinas was being influenced by Buber because Levinas was reading Buber and Heidegger at the same time, and he was having problems with both, honestly, to some degree or another. Because for Buber, it's right. We might say that there's a lot of this relationality is like this thou-it relationship stuff, I and thou and I and it. But then Levinas was pointing out that there was this real problem, which is for Buber, like everything's horizontal, and like everything's reciprocal. Whereas for Levinas, like the ultimate other is God, and therefore is like automatically there. But that led him to make the paradigm of all others as like infinitely non-reciprocal.
Levinas made the paradigm of all others infinitely non-reciprocal.
Like you could never, like it was not that you had to reciprocate, like your responsibility towards the other was not a reciprocation of their responsibilities toward you, but a response to their infinite difference from you, and that you like, and that you could never totalize. I mean, part of this gets also developed post World War II, but like,
are you saying that for Levinas, your obligation to the other was a response to your infinite difference from the other?
Correct.
Okay. Just
correct.
Making sure.
And that is a very different place from, let's say, where you were, let's say, talking about earlier with when you're recognizing the good and beautiful as much as they're similar to you.
My reaction to this is that it's because they infinitely differ from me that I can see them as in the image of my greater self-image, which is the image of God, which is both X and not X.
Yes. But at the same time, I am also an infinite realization of God's image, but in a fundamental, but just we're different infinities that are not right? They're not commensurate, or they're not incommensurate. Is the wrong word, but you operate at this very different.
They have different numerosities or densities or something.
Exactly, but it's also interesting because what ends up happening is it means that Levinas's personalism is less like Buber's and more like the Russian personalisms, which isn't actually surprising because, of course, Levinas has a lot more, I'd say, Eastern European influence than Buber. Personalism in Russia, for instance, the non-Jewish personalist tradition in Russia was very much about host and guest focused, and like the roles, responsibilities of you as a host or a guest, which was non-reciprocal, and it recognized this fundamental difference in responsibility and relationship. So Levinas ends up getting closer to this kind of model, which I think actually has a lot of strengths. That is closer, I'd say, to, I wouldn't say it's Eastern Orthodox exactly, though it has some imprint of coming out of that Eastern European world much more. And I think there's some strong arguments for that biblically as kind of a closer model to what we see in biblical stories about kind of the land of Israel. We are is not essentially Jewish, right? It's we are God's guests there essentially, and and that that could be lost. But also you have the whole Abrahamic tradition of hosting, and what that means as the guy, the man with the tent with the open sides, and the angel coming to him. Whatever. There's this whole other kind of ethic that kind of gets embraced here. That has to do with more communal, communitarian kind of ethic.
So in the Bible there's the like an ethics of hospitality between strangers and dwellers in the land.
Yeah. that there and right, and that part of the founding of Israel has to be this kind of there's all these laws that derive out of what it means to be a stranger, because you knew what it meant to be a stranger in another land, right? Like the Jewish nation
Oh
can't
yeah.
be started. The laws of Sinai can't happen. The covenant of Sinai can't happen without the slavery and subjugation and being a stranger. Those three things specifically, slavery, subjugation, and strangeness, are the three things that God says has to happen for you to become a nation to Abraham at the covenant of the parts. And it gets repeated again in Exodus, in the beginning of Exodus to Moses. It gets repeated again at Sinai. They actually go back fascinatingly, and it's a whole other tangent, but it goes actually back to Hagar and what Sarah does to Hagar, which those three words are used in that story as well. But it also happens to Jacob. Jacob, when he's with Laban in Aram, also goes through those three phases.
Yeah, he does.
So like, but the entire kind of slave morality, I mean, to redeem the phrase from Nietzsche, is based on like the experience of what it means to be a stranger, and therefore you have this whole like ethical system based on not just slave. It's not just slave morality. I think this is part of what Nietzsche misses. It's a lot bigger than that. It's the morality of what it means to exist as a minority on the fringe, as strangers, as all of that. I should go back to work.
Okay.
But I want you to, if you want to respond to that before I go back.
No, I mean, the thing is, unfortunately, in some ways, I have something of a one-track mind. I can track with you, and no one has your breadth of learning here. I can't think of anyone. Maybe Nate is the only person I would think of with a similar level of erudition. So I can sort of track with you as you lay these things out. I don't always have like non-trivial responses to them. I sort of remain consumed, or at least like my initial starting point for these things is always this metalogical relationship between logic, or like the way of distinction, and then this other thing that it implicitly distinguishes itself from. So for me, I keep kind of like the grist in the mill keeps coming from that tension, or that difference. And I probably will keep thinking along these lines in the strange ways that I do. But, whenever you talk about the Bible, it definitely illuminates things for me. And if you tie it into people like Buber and Levinas, whom I only know sort of by acquaintance, but whom I can sense are deeply important, that's useful to me. At some point, maybe I'm just going to get on a subscription plan with one of these internet ADHD companies and treat my ADHD and read. But in the meantime, you're certainly always more than welcome to jump in and interrogate or lecture or relate, whatever you feel moved to, because all forms of interaction with you are welcome by me. So
I appreciate that. I think I don't want to derail your one track. I do want to kind of push it though in other directions. I think that could be useful, because I see a lot. In some ways, you've kind of been circling this point. I think there's a little bit of noise in the system can help here.
So. All right. Well, it might take multiple interactions before we kind of identify.
I need to come on video more clearly.
Yeah.
Okay, man. Have a good one.
Okay, take care, Joseph. Yeah, let me see. Anyone else is welcome to get on. McMosav, Phlebas is probably working. Jason said he can't come on. Sherry, you can come on right now. But what I was going to say, I can talk about strange thoughts that I had last night. Because I was getting into all the hard stuff, like the problem of the one and the many, basically, whether reality really bears description as more than one thing or as one thing. And I thought about the different ways of sort of conceiving kind of the minimal units of reality. There are places where Langen seems to speak of it as inherently, you would say, like multiplex uniform, inherently always a matter of difference within underlying unity. So that the difference is on some level like always legible or visible. And then there's this felt sense that I have of like, if I'm looking at two things, really looking at their difference, there's almost like a koan like question I can ask myself, am I seeing two things or am I actually seeing one thing? And then it is like sort of seeing behind the curtain for such a moment in a way that highlights how the way I want to word it is, non-dual consciousness is not different than dual consciousness. Or that every moment is always, when one sees behind the curtain, it might sound uselessly Mysterian, but when one sees behind the curtain, one sees that every instance of seeing is a seeing behind the curtain. It's not different from everything else. So the question is like sort of reality, if it's one thing or two, and what I seem to find is like if I have a difference like between X and not X, there's the way that the X or the not X is always both, so to speak, ultimately, as highlighted by like its ability to retain a continuous identity over an indefinite number of operations that transform it. The essence is not whatever it appeared to be at first glance, but it retains its identity across, an arbitrary number of like transformations, and that suggests that its limit identity is God, is both X and not X. Again, this is just in logical terms, or as far as logic has anything to say. This is the language that at least suggests itself to me. One can say that just because the thing's ultimate or limit identity is God doesn't mean that it is God. It has to, so to speak, cross an infinite distance to get to that ultimate identity. And then in a weird way, that makes me think of the Kalam cosmological argument, which basically says that if some non-God thing, some created thing, some finite thing, had an infinite past, it wouldn't ever have gotten to, the now that we call the present, or, the place and time that we call now. And so every non-God thing has to have a finite past. And so one can contrapositively derive an implication from this. If non-God thing, then finite past, where if infinite past, or if analogously it has covered some infinite distance, then not non-God. So there's a way of like, there's a way where the way that God creates is like totally mysterious and impenetrable to reason, because it always, when we try to understand it, it always looks like God creating like time and some time before time, and in a space that's outside space, so that the God who's supposedly is supposed to transcend time and space is like somehow always subject to some more original time and space. And it feels like there's an infinite distance between non-God creation and God, and it raises the question of how could it possibly have covered it, and the similar question of by what mechanism can this have come about. And it seems the weird response I have to the earlier objection that the thing's limit, it's only the limit of a thing's identity that is God, and to get to that limit it has to cover an infinite distance. My weird sort of intuitive response to that is, if some non-God thing can have already crossed the infinite distance between God and here and its non-Godness, then it can have already crossed the infinite distance back to its limit identity of God, which is just really strange. But that's how I think about these things. And that the sense that if everything is one, why all this infinitely varied splendor suggests to me that the depth and the richness of this existence is nothing other than God's own unknowing of himself, which is, again, really weird. But God is his own unknowing, which we get back to, like, the difference. I mean, if we understand knowing as a taking according to some definite essence, then the sort of singular reality operation with which God is identifiable, or identical, is like some kind of negation of that, a letting be, a surrendering of one's own will, a self-negation, analogous to Tzimtzum, or I think also what I think of as atonement, at one-ment, when I negate my identity by not giving in to whatever impulse that I have the impulse to identify myself with in the moment, but instead make space for another to speak or for some other feeling to surface. And the reason why I speak of what even just a momentary impulse or whim as my identity, because the reason is that my idea that in the moment, any identity is the identity, but in the moment there's no such qualifier as in the moment. Right now, there's no distinction between now and not now. And so it is my identity, and I sacrifice it. I die to myself, and thereby do nothing other than uncover some more original and deeper identity that was always there. And this is, I make space in my attention for someone or something else, something else other than me. And I make their identity in that way my identity. Because like consciousness is a funny thing, where if you try to say what it is outside of its contents, its defined contents or states, it is like this nothingness, and Sartre did talk about that in Being in Time. And that was one of the comments that I got on yesterday's stream. It was William Branch, and they said that was a nice word salad. Now, do you have Thousand Island dressing? Which was fantastic. Or Mitch's comment that ultimately, or from the ultimate perspective, this conversation is a laugh and a half. And yet, why do I feel compelled to keep interrogating my own thoughts in this way? Don't really know, but except that it's not really authentic to pretend that this is not how these things lay themselves out to me. And it does help to clarify my ideas by even just having to speak aloud in the known presence of someone else, even if I can't entirely be sure what they mean to say, insofar as I know or have a sense of who they are, then that sense of presence itself is meaningful, and it makes me sharpen up and try to express myself more clearly. I do wish someone else would get in here, but there's stuff. Have I encountered Kierkegaard? Unfortunately, I just don't read. This is why Tzimtzum is necessary. Yeah, I think it does work like that, Yosef, or at least I think that's a way in. It's almost a koan. That's really how I think of Tzimtzum, because it's like the self-emptying of the Tao gave rise to the 10,000 things. What it means that the Tao has negated itself is that among the 10,000 things, you will not find the one thing that is the Tao in addition to the 9,999 other things. In that sense, the Tao is dead. It doesn't exist. That's related to what Aquinas meant when he said God doesn't exist. if you take it too straightforwardly or literally, it has the sense of God creating time and some time before time, or stepping out of space into some space outside of space, and that's not really what it's supposed to be. I think of it like a koan. Um, uh, but nonetheless, something like this self-negation operation is operative for each of us, whether we realize we're doing it or not, which is related to my weird note that the seeming of self-judgment, every difference, every judgment is more of a seeming. It has a secondary reality. In other words, what I mean is it tends to not abide. It's not abiding. And the seeming of self-judgment is the isness of non-judgment. It's presupposing some more ultimate or fundamental unity as the backdrop, the necessary backdrop of that operation, insofar as it has any identity as that operation, which is, I know, I'm sorry, it's not useful. And then I lost my earlier thread. But I think that there was something I could have read that would give me almost something to do until someone gets in here. But I don't, maybe it would be the Bible, I'm not sure. But, or maybe I can go ahead and end this stream kind of early, because I can't really think of too much else to discuss. Maybe I'll just sit and think before I go ahead and do anything drastic. You know, there was something that had occurred to me to say that it wasn't a response to what Joseph was saying. It was a response to what I was struggling to say as early as yesterday. And I tried to write it down, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's like if you have a dream and then you try to write down what was in the dream, you know, the dream has evaporated, and what you've written, you don't really know if it corresponds to the dream or not. And in a similar way, see, I said at the level of ultimate reality, it's sort of easy. Now, of course, Joseph did point out that it doesn't say God is it, that man is in God's image and that this is good. It's almost like man lacks something, and like the lack is good. I've heard that opinion before from whom I can't remember. And you know, so there's sort of a way that man, he's looking for the missing piece to complete his identity, which is in a way to presuppose an incompleteness, like in his conception of his own identity. But see, at the level of ultimate reality, I mean, again, setting aside strict accuracy of Bible quotation, it's like if God creates something in his image and calls it good, then the question of whether it's good because he judges it to be, or it's good because of the way the object already is sort of moot. I wonder what happens if I sort of raise the analogous question when I'm looking at something that I love, and I can ask, you know, whether it's in my image of the image because I judge that it is, or if I judge that it's in my image of the image because of some way that it is. This is too much thinking out loud in a way that's probably not useful for anyone. What I wrote when I was talking to Yosef was, do I see it as in the image because I see it as in my image, or do I see it as in my image because I see it as in the image? Now, I guess it would be no difference if and maybe that's the sort of equivalence that I was groping for as early as yesterday. If my highest conception of myself is not of myself simpliciter, or as defined in opposition to any complement, but rather is of my limit identity, namely God, both X and not X. And so maybe that's what I meant, maybe not. And that's already sort of a weird thing to have to rule on, a weird question to rule on, because I'm the only, authority that could answer that. But my sense of encountering this question, it does feel like it comes from some place not me, right? It's at the edge of my known self, or beyond that edge, into what I experience as my complement, my other, my world, my not X, the world outside my eyes, as distinct from the world, behind my eyes, which, as far as you all are concerned, both of those locations are in one place, like this kind of noumenal skull through which everything that I experience would be enclosed, something like that. Yeah. If I knew how to get text on a screen, I might even just try to read the Bible a little bit, see what interesting stuff that produced. I don't think I'd be nearly as interesting as Yosef, or as Jacob, or as Jason. But I would at least want to be able to get the words up there. So let me see, present. Okay, there's a share screen option there. So if I go to Bible Hub Interlinear, and this is Jason's channel, so I don't think it's wrong to show the vocalization of the Tetragrammaton. It might be needlessly triggering. It's not triggering exactly, but is there another place with transliterations available? That doesn't. What am I thinking? I only know of it in apps. No, Bible Hub Interlinear is what Jacob uses anyway. So I'll go to Bible Hub Interlinear. And where am I in Genesis? Genesis 25:22. So Bible Hub Interlinear. Genesis 25. It's the death of Abraham. Okay, and this is way too tiny for me to read. 25:22, and I'm going to come down here, and then I'm going to share my screen. And really, I should get some kind of parallel with just the English. If I present, share screen. Wait, no, I don't want to share screen. I just want to. Does it work to do it like this? What? Discord is its whole own window? This might not even have the effect that I intend it to have. Oh yeah, see, Drosta effect. Oh gosh, that's ironic. If I do this, is there a great big problem? I don't know. See, if I come and check back, it's going to Drosta effect again. StreamYard is sharing a window. I think this is probably fine. I dare not check. And I have to zoom in. 25:22. How come it goes right from 21 to 23? I'm so clueless. This is sad. Oh no, here it is. Okay. Oh, I guess. What is this about? Like Jacob and Esau struggling in the womb? Maybe, I don't know. And that's still too small for me to read. Yeah, this is better. What is that? Vayit rotsatsu. Vayit rotsatsu habanim bekirba. Vatomer im ken lama ze anochi vatelech lidrosh et Adonai. So they struggled, the sons within her, and she said, if so, why thus to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Oh yeah, and he said, in your womb are two nations, right? Yeah. And Jacob he loves, and Esau he hates. Yeah, that's sort of getting into like the what I said earlier, like the if love is seeing one's own likeness in something, and God is like the identity, like the both X and not X, then there's not anything that he can't see his likeness in. I did have the sense to talk about that today. And so like in other words, like the wrath of God, the judging out of God judging something as not being in his image, or his image of the image, but in that case, whether it's the image, whether it's the image simpliciter, or whether it's just his image of the images, it's moot. It's the same. But the idea that he would ever judge something out of it, like and so that it would be subject to his wrath, that seems like an oxymoron, where God is the broadest conceivable identity. Because you would know that whatever was some identity such that something else was judged out of it, you would know that by definition is not the broadest conceivable identity, if only because there is a broader conceivable identity still, namely the one that did not judge that thing as not in its image. And so I had the sense to talk about that. I also, the Droste effect. See, I need to stop being so illiterate about these things. Oh, they're good. Okay. Oh, and I'm back to being alone. Back to sort of monadic, pre-creative perfection. The other thing I was going to talk about was this New Age idea that you sort of pre-exist yourself, and then as in order for things to have meaning, you have to forget what you already knew, before you existed yourself, pre-existed yourself, before you existed, and then like afterward, to what extent will you retain the sort of knowledge that results from having seen the fuller meaning of your life from the perspective of not only your own perspective, but of everyone else with whom you're related? Well, you have to forget all that too, as a function of further existence having meaning. That's an interesting question. One thing that I don't want to do at the outset is absolutely rule out the possibility that you might have known something before you, so to speak, came down here. Because it seems to me that the nature of the reality in which we live and move and have our being is like essentially free and unconstrained. I don't want to rule anything out, but at the same time, it also seems potentially problematic to say that it is a necessary condition of existence having meaning that one must forget what one previously knew. And I did at least briefly touch on my sense that the ultimate reality cannot forget. And that anything that comes into existence is there for keeps. Whatever begins to exist in time exists always in eternity. And so that the nature of reality is like profoundly additive and non-subtractive. And that this is in fact why, because this is because identities are relentlessly integrated with each other. This is why the judgment happens, where I have to experience the one whom I call other now. I have to join at some point my identity with theirs, it would seem, and I have to experience the consequences of my actions from their point of view, and in that way, I will judge myself in a in a more expanded sense. When once myself has sort of become integrated with this other identity, then from that place I'll pass judgment on what I formerly called myself, and that already happens in this life with empathy and guilt and maturity. When we do things that are hurtful to our parents as teenagers, we can regret and repent of that when we become older and become parents ourselves, etc. So it would be curious to suppose that as we move farther in toward the limit of our identity toward God, that we would have to forget. It's also suggesting that what it's really analogous to is the move that says that the one is dependent on two-ness, because any unity is going to necessarily be of distinct things. Now that has some compelling logic, but at the same time, insofar as the one is like notionally, as it were, by definition, beyond logic, is not subject to logic like that. One might say something like that it both does and does not presuppose that two-ness or that distinction. Which is, of course, in another way, not to say very much. But the idea of making it absolutely subject to difference or distinction, the existence thereof, that doesn't seem right to me. It's not clear to me why we would have to forget things in order for further existence to have meaning. Typically, like in the New Age, this is seen in terms of reincarnation, where you lived a previous incarnation, and then in order for your future incarnation to have meaning, you have to forget all that you learned, after the end of your previous incarnation, which might involve remembrance of all other sort of previous, like linearly previous ? Incarnations. But in any case, you have to forget it all in order for the next go round to have meaning. Not that this should count for very much necessarily, but my reaction to that is something like a sense of cosmic nausea or of drowning, in which your head is like repeatedly forced beneath the surface. It seems to me that the reality, or the God in whom we live and move and have our being, is knowledge philic, not knowledge phobic. Like, he keeps integrating and adding, and he does not forget. And events are not ever erased. They're just recontextualized so that their meaning can change, but they're not fundamentally ever erased. It's just that more information around them is added. The picture is deepened. Um, so yeah, for that reason, I don't really think that the notion of having to forget something one already knew necessarily makes a lot of sense. Uh, I see something compelling in the idea of a pre-existence, if only because uh, the eternity, beyond time is not really more. It's not any more post-existence than it is pre-existence. But I'm not sure it looks like anything as straightforward as like I pre-exist and I know stuff and then I forget it, and then I remember it later. And there was something else. There's always something else. The sense that like we were in the pre-existence, we chose to come down here. We were in eternity. We were with God. We chose to come down here, so that we could have a fuller experience of what it's like to exist up there. You see that commonly in the New Age. When I analyze it in the terms that I increasingly understand things in, it's like to say that like the eternity, which ought to be convertible with God, is the ultimate reality. Like the eternity like was lacking in some respect, was not in the image of God, therefore, or of the good. Therefore we chose to come down here, so that when we returned up there, it would be what it already was. I mean, now that does rhyme with what I said earlier about sort of the one finding itself through distinction, and then sort of seeing the place where it started as an instance of itself, or the one, or the absolute unity. Does rhyme with that, but I'm not sure it. It almost it still feels a little bit too much like a story, like a just so story, like a fable, like a 2D image, but not really the real thing. I feel like the real thing is going to involve like just as much like as the other dialectical pole. It's going to involve like the creation of something genuinely new, that from nothing, and that through the experience of contrast, it rises toward the sort of absolute light of being, or existence, or goodness that is God. And in a similar way that just even the experience of like planning and executing a motor movement, it involves well, I guess it's really on an unconscious level, but the setting of a target, there's an idealization or an abstraction, and you try to reach it, you overshoot, you undershoot, there's feedback, and so on, like that. It's immediate, intuitive, natural. And I don't suppose it would ever have to involve the forgetting of things that are already known or true. If existence could not be infinitely fulfilling on its own terms, then it would not be in the image of the image, or of God. which it has to be the ultimacy of ultimate reality being such that every reality is ultimately ultimate reality, or it's in its image. Like they say, everything that is in God is God. But of course, I don't really know. I don't really know, nor do I know things like, this notion of final unity with God. Is it something? I mean, the way that we conceive it, because we do conceive things in terms of predicates and complements, we do see it like a unity that results in some sort of erasure of one's identity. But I'm not sure that it works like that. I've had the thought of like a mosaic where there's a unity across the pieces. It doesn't mean that a particular piece ceases to be what it is or goes out of existence, but it's a seeing of the whole. And interestingly, when you see the whole, what's interesting, if I ask my mind, what do I see? The answer is you see many things. And any oneness that is here in the experience, the oneness being the essence of reality, like the mutual reality, interrelatedness of things, like that's what their reality consists in. That oneness is not anything I see. It's invisible, which is interestingly gets at the Bible's usage of, I think in Greek and Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken, of eternal and invisible as synonymous. But like there's the sense that the eternal is more real, not less. So that's quite interesting. But why did I get into that? I was saying that the oneness is invisible, but see, now I can't even recall where I got on that. Yeah, like the sense of like the final oneness, and does it dissolve one's sort of human or earthly identity, or does it presuppose it, or something else? Getting a call. Yeah. That's quite interesting. And another thing that I think about is unity, at least ordinarily. It involves the discrimination of some coherent identity, which in turn seemes to presuppose, maybe even like / generate a backdrop complement. And so at one point I had the thought that maybe the point of union with God is the point at which some new creation, like my reunion with God, is also going to be everyone else's reunion with God. But at that point is when sort of a new creation comes into being. But again, that's presupposing that mode of union, whatever it is something that will generate a complement or backdrop. Yeah, these things are hard to think about. In classical theism, one has this sense that the fullness or the repletion of the one or God is such as is like sort of effortlessly, naturally generating creation, like this sort of lesser reality of otherness, difference, I don't know. But it itself does not require them for its existence, so it's asymmetrical. It would be nice to sort of find the logical intuition as to how this must be. Insofar as it's notionally beyond logic, though, it's sort of minimizing a priori any chance or hope of finding purchase. any purchase or traction for logic to get on the one. And it's related to what I think about, like when I think about the incomprehensible way that it creates anything at all, or that anything proceeds from it. Because to know the way that it proceeded from it, you have to define it somewhat as a term. Yeah, also, I reached out to my friend Craig about this because we were once discussing Kant and his project of trying to find out whether it's possible to have synthetic a priori knowledge, which means something like a priori means like it's logically necessary. It's not being true is not conceivable. It's logically necessary. But at the same time, it's synthetic. So it's true of the world. It's non-trivial. It adds to our knowledge of the world. So that, if I say that every bachelor is an unmarried male, people don't necessarily really feel edified by that, like that added to their knowledge in any meaningful way. But that fire is hot, something which one seemingly must learn through experience. If I could know that in a way that's logically necessary, that would be quite intriguing. So that was something like Kant's project. At least, I seem to know this secondhand. And my friend Craig said something quite compelling, which suggested that all knowledge must be a priori ultimately. And so that there's a sort of discovery of the sense in which their truth is logically necessary. That rhymes with something I felt about, like, the way creation seems to happen. It looks like things are added to eternity, which can only mean from another perspective that they're just discovered to have always already been in eternity. And I think what led me to the idea that all knowledge must ultimately be sort of a priori or like logically necessitated is sort of getting into causation itself. Causation is, it's like the reason, it's the necessity of something's existence. This is again, it's illustrating the difficulty of understanding the sense in which God creates anything at all. Because unless the world was already in God, let's say as an entailment of God, such that there was no choice but for it to unspool as an implication of God, then we have the following scenario where, and I need to say this before I forget, but that sense of it always having been there of an implication is not one that I'm prepared to fully endorse. I feel like the only time that the time that it is most true is in retrospect, when one is seeking an explanation. But there's a limit to how much there's explanations only go so far. They only cover so much. Then one asks another question, and then there's a sense in which the answer to the question doesn't exist before the question or until the question is asked. But nonetheless, so unless we're supposing that what the academic or the analytic philosophers call a modal collapse, unless we're supposing that the world was already sort of in God as an implication of God in its way as logically necessary as God, then we have a condition where like the world was created, for some reason. It owes its existence to something. Something logically determined it. Yeah. So like, Chris Langan talks about, to the extent that a thing is not determined, it's like it's actually in superposition. It's both whatever it's determined to be and not. It's like the cat that's both alive and dead, or it's something red and green all over, so to speak. It hasn't what do I want to say? It hasn't been differentiated from its complement. So it's not there as a decided or determined phenomenon. And so one almost feels that way with creation, unless there's some reason, something that necessitated it, and that so that it's discriminated or is distinguished from its complement or negation. Insofar as creation is finite or gains its identity in opposition to something else. But then that reason itself has a reason, or it doesn't exist. Something logically necessary, something compelling. Causation is determination on some level, because if it's not determined, we keep asking why. This is really just like the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that comes into being does so for a reason, and absent a reason, there's an indeterminacy that really is like a contradiction in some place where contradiction shouldn't be. A contradiction is sort of a both and or a neither nor. Nothing in perceptible macro reality is like both red and green all over, we say. But something, some field that's supposed to have a defined value in it, if it has an undefined value in it, it's like a contradiction. And certainly there would be a problem in the realm of perceptible reality if the place of my origin, the manner of my origin, was this kind of unspeakable neither nor, both X and not X thing that was red and green all over. It always has the form of like some decided or manifest phenomenon. And so there's a way that either the existence of the creation was already the one or the God as a sort of entailment thereof, or infinite regress, which for the classical theists was problematic. For Thomas Aquinas, that's one of his 5 ways, proceeds on the impossibility of an infinite regress. So it's quite an ironic spot to be in now. I know there's been lots of ink spilled over the modal collapse, stuff, and I'm definitely not aware of all of it, but I'm just kind of giving a sketch of how these things go. The thing is, what I said about explanation, though, it's like if I understood the sense in which something was logically necessitated by the one, there's a certain way that invests the one with a defined logical nature that it's not, so to speak, comfortable with. And so, in a sense, it changes. In another sense, it's discovered to have always already been something other or more than that. And that amounts to sort of a hitting of the refresh button. And it's and it highlights a sort of insufficiency or inadequacy on the part of any explanation. So yeah, I guess I would say that dialectically there does seem to be a sense in which any causation is like a kind of logical necessitation. But the ultimate uncaused cause is such as does not admit of the kind of static or stable logical identification that any system of logical deduction typically presupposes. So anyway, that's what I'll say about that. Gosh, that, or I mean, I'm somewhat aware that this is not really helpful to most people, nor is it how most people think about these things. But I did say some things in here that I thought were useful to get into, that they were the answer to some questions that I thought were worth asking. Well, it's 12 p.m. Can read a little bit more. Vayomer Adonai la shnei goyim mevit nech ushnei leumim mime'ach, and said God to her, in your nation are two wombs, two peoples from your body shall be separated, and one people will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Maybe that'll be a sign that rhymes with something later. Let me see. I like the midrash that every soul being taught the Torah before birth, but then that teaching being erased. But these all arise from the Platonic ideas of learning as remembering. Okay, that's really good. Yeah, and I'm not sure that's totally false. But I'm also not sure that it's actually the whole story, because I feel like the whole story involves like poles of both being and becoming, that the real story is sort of generated by the tension between those two. That's the sense that I really get. And any time that you ask, is reality this or that, it's almost forcing it to be something not strictly either of those two things, but beyond the initial sort of binary between those two things. And that's it. The nature of reality has to be such as like it eternally evades the force of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So there's that way where it's almost forced to go beyond whatever sort of logical binary in which one had slotted it or placed it. It's like a feature, not a bug. It has to be that way. It's Friday. I work all week. Let's do a chat ASAP. Yeah, and that's like the nature of the reality that we inhabit, like of the spiritual afterworld. Not only do I think it's like not static and already defined, it's like it can't be. It has to be like on some level undefined and free to be the most beautiful thing or arrangement conceivable. My favorite near-death experience that I've heard of is that of Steve Gardepee, where he's shot down in a helicopter over the jungles of Vietnam, and as he's dying on the jungle ground, he has a sense of a light that is like nuclear in its intensity or brightness. And normally light is blinding as it increases, and it was at first, but then as beyond the level where it was blinding, it as it intensified, it just became clear, and then clearer, and clearer still. And then he encountered some kind of like intentionality. Um, that was, I mean, even that's much too small a word. It's like saying he encountered a person, but really it's more like he encountered, personality. But then again, it's like, am I a person, or am I the limit of personhood? Am I personality? And I sort of have to be that in order to be what you interact with as a person. When you interact with me, someone who's capable of anything in a certain sense. And that mind, that presence, that other was like a roaring hearth in terms of his warmth, and in terms of the love that he was, and that fire, let's say that does not consume. It showed him an image of a premature baby, and he was born premature, and he felt like all of God's paternal pride, when God showed him that baby. And it was, if I remember correctly, it was like that warmth, or that fire. He roared with laughter. Just the inexpressible sense of the vastness of his love and his pride, and the paternal nature of it. And but see, before that, he as he was dying, he looked into a plant, and he had the sense that's very common in NDEs of being able to zoom in arbitrarily, close, near or far, with his own eyesight, to whatever he wanted to see. And he could zoom into the cells of the plant, and he understood, the biochemistry of how the cells worked. And as he sort of zoomed into the workings of the plant, he became the workings of the plant. And that's sort of related to what I was saying. Like, in the moment, any identity is the identity, but in the moment, there's no such qualifier as in the moment. And so it's like the sense that if one is in the image of God, one is in possession by birthright of a treasure so vast that it's not constrained to not become anything that you care to name or look upon. And it's sort of that freedom and that godlike power that we are being prepared for, I feel. I don't really feel like it's at least as far as my own logic and reasoning is any guide, I don't see it as being the sort of 2D heaven, or even heaven on earth, in human bodies that we conceive of it as. But yet, there's already a certain freedom to consciousness, and there's a freedom to these NDEs, like where they can basically, the more you study them, the more you sort of realize these are people's own sort of highest conception of God. These are people's own conception of God, but sort of at the level where it's unconscious. Even that is actually not enough, because, again, given the sort of the inner definition between self and other, or self and like world, oneself and one's world, it's not even that. It's just their imagining of God as that. God, it's like God is in their imagination as their imagination, and there's an interplay that's just always going on. That wasn't very clear. But nonetheless, the really subjective nature of these things, and the way that they differ so much from each other, and the way that they seem all too personal in ways that do not make them feel like they could be the sort of generalized or public or intersubjective reality that we imagine is what we would all occupy together, in one place. You get the sense from these that these are people's highest imaginings of God. It's like in a place of untrammeled imagination. And you can kind of view this existence as like trying to imagine the love than which none greater can be conceived, like under conditions of constraint or opposition or adversity. But yet there's a way that it despite the freedom that comes with our imagination, it all seems to keep returning to these constraints that God is seemingly quite insistent upon. However far my thoughts may go, despite whatever I might imagine possible, they always come back to this place where I keep looking at these two hands, not anybody else's. And something else I was going to say. Yeah, well, I think the thought might have left my mind, but it was to do with the way that God seems to be quite insistent, on our sort of returning always to these identities that we have. Well, that's a pity. I can't, but it's not uncommon for me. Can't really remember what I was going to say there. But it might be time to end the stream soon. I never really ate breakfast today. Maybe that's why part of why I'm going so slow. Yeah. The problem is that when I get off the stream, I'm going to remember more stuff that I wished I had said. But like somehow only if I get off the stream. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess it's been long enough. Just a lot of thanks to anyone who was willing to interact with me. Special thanks to Yosef. And wish it had been different, a little better, but there's a reason why it had to happen the way that it did, and why I had to say the things I actually said rather than what I wished I would have said. So it just has to be what it is, and it'll be better as what it has been. So yeah, I'm gonna end the stream. Thank you guys. Have a blessed day.